Hi, I'm Alex Worsnip, and in this video, I'm going to talk about the issues that are raised in my chapter for this handbook. The chapter is called The Skeptic and the Climate Change Skeptic. So traditional philosophical skepticism is the view that we have little, if any, knowledge of the external world around us. And figuring out what, if anything, we can say to the traditional philosophical skeptic is often taken as one of the great challenges of philosophy. Now, in real life, there aren't many of these traditional skeptics who deny that we have any knowledge of the external world around us. But there are some people who call themselves skeptics, including self-described climate change skeptics. Now, figuring out what, if anything, we can say to the climate change skeptic is usually not taken as one of the great challenges of philosophy. It's usually thought, well, that person is just obviously being irrational or ignoring the evidence, and there's no real philosophical puzzle about what we should say about them. However, what I'm going to try and convince you is that there might be more of a parallel between the traditional philosophical skeptic and the climate change skeptic than you think. So let's consider how the traditional skeptic's strategy for arguing for skepticism operates. So the traditional skeptic has something that we can call a skeptical scenario. An example is a scenario in which you're a brain in a vat, or in which you're dreaming, or in which you're being deceived by an evil demon. And basically, that skeptical scenario will be one in which, even though it looks like you're sitting in a room watching a video, this is all being faked, actually you're dreaming it, or actually you're a brain in a vat being made to think that you're sitting in a room watching a video. And then what the traditional skeptic says is that since you can't rule that skeptical scenario out, you can't know that you're actually, in fact, sitting in a room watching a video. You could be dreaming, or you could be a brain in a vat. Now, at least a particular kind of climate change skeptic argues in a similar way. So they also have a skeptical scenario. Let's call that skeptical scenario the conspiracy scenario. So basically the scenario is this. It's something like the following hypothesis, that even though there is this scientific consensus that climate change is happening, that consensus is the result of a huge conspiracy. The data behind it has been faked by scientists. They've been motivated by politics, a political agenda, and the desire to advance their careers, and all dissenters within the field have been silenced. And then the climate change skeptic, or at least this particular form of climate change skeptic, says, since you can't rule out that conspiracy scenario, you can't know that climate change or anthropogenic climate change is actually occurring. So, as I hope you can see, there's a parallel between how these two arguments work. And there's a further crucial parallel as well, which is that both skeptical scenarios are sort of designed in this almost sneaky way to explain away any evidence against them. So you might say, well, I've got some evidence that I'm not a brain in a vat, that it doesn't look like I'm a brain in a vat. And the skeptic says, but of course, the people controlling the brains in vats don't want you to know that you're a brain in a vat, so they make it look like you're not a brain in a vat. So they just build further details into the skeptical scenario to explain away any evidence against it. Similarly, the climate change skeptic, anything you can come up with to say, well, like wouldn't someone have uncovered this huge conspiracy if it was happening? Wouldn't there have been people who'd found the data that shows that climate change is not really happening? The climate change skeptic says, well, those people have been silenced. Those people have been denied the opportunity to publish their results in the top journals. They've been forced out of the profession, and so that's why you're not hearing from them. So in both cases, the skeptical scenario is kind of designed or augmented to explain away any evidence that you might have against it. Now, the question of what we can say to these skeptics, if anything, to get them to rationally change their mind is actually a pretty similar one, I think, across the traditional skeptic and the climate change skeptic's case. And there are a range of possible solutions to that problem that I explore in the chapter but can't get into here. But there are a couple of general upshots that I want to highlight in this short video. So the first is just this, that there's an underlying issue here, which is what are the criteria for choosing between competing hypotheses that purport to explain our evidence? So in the case of the traditional skeptic, we have the hypothesis that there is an external world and it's basically roughly how it seems to be. And then there's the hypothesis that actually we're brains in bats. Now, both of those hypotheses purport to explain our evidence. So what are the criteria for choosing between those hypotheses? Similarly, in the case of the climate change skeptic, we have a certain amount of evidence, which is that scientists say that climate change is happening. And then there are two different hypotheses that purport to explain that evidence. One is that climate change actually is happening, and another is that there's this huge conspiracy to make it seem like climate change is happening. So what are the criteria for choosing between those hypotheses? And I think this actually shows why the debate over traditional skepticism matters. Some people think it's kind of silly, example of kind of the excesses of philosophy, but it's really a way of dramatizing these questions about what are the criteria for choosing between competing hypotheses that purport to explain our evidence? And that question does come up in our everyday lives, like when we're engaging with the climate change skeptic. And finally, I think it's important to see that our solutions to these two different puzzles should be able to march in lockstep. So our solution to the traditional skeptical puzzle had better be generalizable to the challenge from someone like the climate change skeptic. And I actually think some of the solutions to the traditional puzzle aren't, and generalizable to the climate change skeptic, and that tells against them. So I hope I've managed to convince you that there's a parallel between these two arguments, and that's a reason for taking the skeptical challenge in both cases somewhat seriously and thinking about how we can answer it.